The Ukrainian combined arms assault that launched at 4:44 a.m. Thursday lasted 94 minutes from first contact to the moment the Russian regimental command net went silent. And the silence was not tactical radio discipline. It was the sound of a command structure that had stopped functioning. Thursday, March 19th, Kherson Oblast. The 46th Airmobile Brigade had spent 11 days preparing an operation that its commanding officer had described to the Army planning staff as a timing problem, not a firepower problem. The Russian defensive position across the Dnieper River's eastern bank was not outgunned. It was not undermanned. It had been constructed over 6 months by a Russian engineering corps that had used the river's natural barrier to build a layered defensive depth that the Ukrainian side of the river's observation could not fully resolve. The river bend itself masked the second and third defensive lines from direct optical observation, and the TB2 collection that had been running daily for 4 weeks had produced imagery sufficient to map the first line's positions in detail and the second line's approximate layout, but not the third line's specific emplacement. A river assault against a 3-line defense whose third line was incompletely mapped was a significant operational risk. The 46th's commanding officer had assessed the risk and had concluded that the third line's incomplete mapping was not the operational problem. The operational problem was crossing the river to the first line before the Russian command could alert the second line and position its reserve. Everything after the first line was a function of speed. The 94 minutes was how long the speed held. The air assault element launched first. 12 Mi-8 transport helicopters carrying 2 companies of assault infantry departed the Western Bank staging area at 4:11 a.m., flying at 30 meters altitude under the electronic warfare coverage that the brigade's EW section was providing against the Russian air defense radars on the eastern bank. Not suppression. Suppression would have required active emissions that Russian SIGINT would detect and interpret as a pre-assault indicator. Deception emissions. False radar returns and frequency spectrum noise that Russian radar operators would spend 40 seconds to 2 minutes classifying before determining it was jamming rather than real contacts. 40 seconds to 2 minutes of ambiguity. The Mi-8s crossed the river at 4:19 a.m. The first helicopter landed on the eastern bank at 4:22 a.m. The last at 4:27 a.m. 211 soldiers were on the eastern bank before the Russian radar operators had fully resolved what was crossing. The ground assault element was already moving when the helicopters landed. 6 Leopard 2A6 tanks and 12 M2A2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles crossing the 3 pre-positioned pontoon bridges that the Ukrainian engineering company had emplaced underwater at night during the 3 preceding nights. The bridges were submerged by day to prevent aerial observation and were raised to operational height in the 22 minutes before the assault launched, using a mechanical raising system that the engineering company had rehearsed under darkness 4 times in the preceding week. Submerged bridges, invisible to satellite and aerial collection, raised in 22 minutes by crews who had done it 4 times in the dark. The Russian intelligence picture of the crossing preparation was 0. Not degraded, 0, because the preparation methodology had been specifically designed around the limitation of Russian collection rather than around the bridge construction procedures that previous river crossing operations had used. The Leopards crossed the river at 4:31 a.m., 9 minutes after the first helicopter touched down on the eastern bank. The Russian first-line defensive position was 1.4 kilometers from the river's eastern bank. The Leopard column was moving at 22 kilometers per hour on a route that the ground reconnaissance, conducted by the 46th Special Operations Element in small boats over 4 nights, had assessed as passable for tracked vehicles at that speed. The Russian first-line position would be in direct fire range at 4:35 a.m., 4 minutes from the river crossing. In those 4 minutes, the Russian early warning system on the eastern bank that had survived the EW deception needed to transmit a contact report to the first-line battalion. The battalion needed to alert its crew-served weapons and Kornet teams, and those teams needed to occupy their fighting positions. The standard alert time for a Russian motor rifle company from sleeping to fully alert and in fighting positions was assessed at 6 to 8 minutes. The assault had 4 minutes of approach from the river to the first-line engagement range. What's your call? Type A, if the submerged bridge approach, achieving crossing surprise before the alert system activated, was the single most decisive innovation in the 46th's operation design. Type B, if the air assault element, landing 201 soldiers on the eastern bank before the helicopters were classified as contacts, was more decisive. Drop your answer below. The Kornet teams in the first line's northern sector were not in their fighting positions at 4:35 a.m. 4 minutes had not been enough time for the partial alert that the Eastern Bank early warning post had managed to transmit at 4:29 a.m., 7 minutes after the first helicopter landed, 2 minutes after the last, to reach the Kornet section commanders and produce occupied fighting positions. The alert had reached the first-line battalion's command post. The duty officer at the command post had attempted to transmit the alert to the company commanders on the north and south of the first line. The northern company's radio had been in the middle of a scheduled maintenance cycle when the alert arrived. A coincidence of timing that the operations planners had not engineered, but that the 40-second EW deception window and the 4-minute approach time had conspired to produce. The northern Kornet teams were not at their positions because the alert had not reached them. The lead Leopard crossed the 400-meter engagement threshold at 4:35 a.m. and encountered no anti-tank fire from the northern sector. The two Kornet teams in the southern sector had received the alert through the Southern Company's functioning radio and had reached their fighting positions at 4:34 a.m., 1 minute before the Leopard column entered engagement range. Both fired. 4 Kornet missiles total, 3 intercepted by trophy APS on the lead and second Leopards. The fourth impacted the second Leopard's turret side at an angle that the trophy system's engagement geometry had not been optimal for. A shot from an elevation above the standard engagement plane, from a firing position on a low ridge that the pre-mission satellite imagery had not shown as occupied. The trophy system's horizontal engagement corridor was the reason the fourth missile found a gap. The round impacted. The Leopard's composite side armor defeated the penetration. The Kornet's tandem heat warhead at the angle of impact produced a crater in the composite and a spall pattern inside the turret that destroyed the communication system and wounded the gunner's left arm. The vehicle continued to operate. The gunner continued to operate. The crew commander transmitted the contact on the company net, received acknowledgement, and continued the advance at the same pace. The PZH-2000 battery's counterfire mission against the ridge-based Kornet position was transmitted at 4:36 a.m., 61 seconds after the first Kornet shot. Excalibur impact at 4:37 a.m. The ridge position's 2-person crew was destroyed 47 seconds after wounding the gunner of the vehicle they had hit. The northern sector's Kornet teams, whose alert had not arrived in time, were engaged by the air assault infantry that had landed 1.4 kilometers to the east of the first-line trench at 4:22 a.m. and had been moving toward the trench's rear approach for the 13 minutes it took the ground assault to close from the river. The air assault infantry hit the northern Kornet positions from the east at 4:38 a.m., from the direction the positions had not been oriented to cover, because no operational planning in the Russian first line had accounted for 211 Ukrainian soldiers being on the eastern bank before the alarm went off. The first-line trench clearance lasted 22 minutes, not 34, not 41, as the previous week's operations had produced. 22 minutes, because the combination of Leopard direct fire suppressing the covered positions from the west and air assault infantry clearing the open trench sections from the east created simultaneous pressure from 2 directions that a trench network designed for a single assault direction could not effectively defend against. 31 Russian soldiers were captured. 47 were dead. 14 withdrew east toward the second line. The 46th commanding officer, monitoring the TB2 feed from the forward command post, assessed the first-line clearance at 4:58 a.m. and transmitted the exploitation order at 5:00 a.m., 2 minutes after the clearance was complete. The exploitation toward the second line was the operation's highest risk phase. The second line was 3.8 kilometers east of the first. The route between them had been partially mapped by the TB2 and partially by the pre-operation ground reconnaissance, but the reconnaissance teams had been unable to assess the full route without risking detection. There was a 700-meter section between the first and second lines where the route's terrain was assessed from imagery rather than direct observation. The imagery assessment was that the terrain was passable for tracked vehicles. The direct observation assessment, which would have been more reliable, did not exist. The 700-meter section was a calculated risk. The calculated risk materialized at 5:14 a.m. when the lead Leopard's track section sank into soft ground in the imagery-assessed terrain at the 1.8-kilometer mark. The ground was not what the imagery had indicated. It was marshy, winter water retention under a crust that the satellite's optical sensor had resolved as firm soil. The lead Leopard was immobilized. The column stopped. The route was blocked. The 4 vehicles behind the lead Leopard could not pass it on the right because the marshy ground extended 60 meters in that direction. The left was clear. The engineering reconnaissance team that had been moving 400 meters ahead of the column had already passed this point on its own. Lighter vehicles and had not experienced the same sinkage. The Leopard could go left. The column could bypass left. The bypass cost 11 minutes while the column commander assessed the route, transmitted the route change to the engineering team ahead, and led the remaining 5 Leopards around the immobilized vehicle. The M88 recovery vehicle that had been positioned at the rear of the armored column moved forward to begin extraction. The lead Leopard's crew remained with the vehicle and began the manual extraction process. The vehicle was free at 5:31 a.m., 17 minutes after immobilization. The column had not waited. The column had bypassed and continued. The lead Leopard rejoined the column at the second line's outer perimeter at 5:44 a.m. Subscribe to my channel and hit the bell. Every minute of the 94, the river crossing, the trench clearance, the marsh bypass, the second and third line assault, broken down completely. This is what we build here. The second line was reached at 5:27 a.m., 27 minutes after the first line clearance, including the 11-minute bypass delay. The Russian second line had been alerted. The 14 first-line survivors withdrawing east had reached the second line's observation post at 5:11 a.m., 16 minutes before the Ukrainian column arrived. 16 minutes was enough time to alert, not enough time to reconstitute an effective Kornet defense. 2 of the second line's 4 Kornet positions were in their fighting positions when the column reached engagement range. 2 were still occupying positions that had been dormant. The second line had been held at lower readiness on the assessment that a Ukrainian river assault was unlikely. The second line engagement lasted 31 minutes. The company commander had coordinated a reactive defense in 16 minutes. BTR-82A vehicles covering the approach corridor, RPG teams in fighting positions. The Bradleys engaged the 3 BTR-82As from 800 meters with 25 mm Bushmaster, all 3 destroyed in the first 4 minutes. The RPG teams were addressed by the air assault infantry that had been following the armored column since the first line, mounted on available vehicle lift, dismounting 200 meters from the second trench, using the Leopard's direct fire smoke to reach the trench flanks unobserved. The second line was cleared at 5:58 a.m. 19 Russian soldiers captured, 33 dead. The company commander was among the captured. His BTR had been disabled by a Bushmaster round before he reached the third line. The third line was 2.1 kilometers further east. The 46th commanding officer had assessed the approach to the third line as the operations determining phase. If the exploitation force could reach the third line before the Russian regiment's reserve company, which the TB2 had been tracking 7 kilometers east of the second line since 5:01 a.m., could establish a prepared defense in the third line's positions, the clearance would be manageable. If the reserve company arrived and occupied the third line before the exploitation force reached it, the assault would face a fresh reserve in prepared positions that had not been under fires. The reserve company had been moving west since 5:40 a.m. The exploitation force had been moving east since 5:58 a.m. 2 forces converging on the same 2.1-kilometer terrain from opposite directions. The HIMARS battery at corps level had been tracking the reserve company since 5 a.m. At 5:58 a.m., the moment the second line was cleared, the reserve company was 4.8 kilometers from the third line, and the exploitation force was 2.1 kilometers from it. The exploitation force would arrive first if it maintained pace. The HIMARS battery transmitted a targeting solution at 6:04 a.m. against the reserve company's vehicle column at a road junction 3.9 kilometers east of the third line. Two GMLR's rockets. The lead vehicles were struck at 6:07 a.m. The reserve company halted for 9 minutes. By the time it resumed movement at 6:16 a.m., the exploitation force had been in contact with the third line for 4 minutes. What would you do as the Russian regimental commander at 6:15 a.m.? Thursday, first line cleared, second line cleared, company commander captured, reserve company halted by HIMARS and resuming movement, but already behind the exploitation force's arrival at the third line? Comment your decision below. The third line contact developed at 6:12 a.m. when the lead Leopard acquired the first thermal signatures at 1,400 meters. The third line was not fully prepared. The T-80 BVM in a hull-down position 600 meters behind the trench had not been in the TB2's resolved picture. The Leopard engaged it at 1,400 meters with DM-63 on first contact. First round hit. The T-80 BVM did not return fire. The third line clearance ran from 6:12 a.m. to 6:18 a.m., 6 minutes. Not 22 like the first line. Not 31 like the second. 6 minutes because the third line was at a fraction of the defensive density of the first two. The reserve company had not arrived. The unit holding it was an undermanned placeholder, and the exploitation force that reached it carried the momentum of 44 minutes of continuous successful advance. The 6-minute clearance was the operational expression of everything the preceding 88 minutes had produced. At 6:18 a.m. on Thursday, March 19th, the Ukrainian 46th Airmobile Brigade held all 3 Russian defensive lines on the Dnieper's eastern bank in its sector. The distance from the river to the third line was 7.3 kilometers. The time from the first helicopter landing to the third line clearance was 94 minutes and 31 seconds. At 6:19 a.m., the Russian regimental command net went silent. The first minute registered as normal communication discipline. The second was noted. The third triggered an alert to the 46th intelligence officer. The 7th minute produced the assessment. The regimental command had either been struck, no strike had been called against the command post, whose precise location had not been established, or had lost communications capability, or had conducted a deliberate halt for reasons not accessible. The intelligence officer's report at 6:26 a.m. used the phrase, "Command net appears non-functional." It was not a strike. The TB2 imagery of the command post area at 6:31 a.m. showed the vehicles present and apparently undamaged. The silence was voluntary. The regimental commander, whose first line had been cleared, whose second line had been cleared, whose company commander had been captured, whose reserve had been struck by HIMARS and was still 3.4 kilometers from the third line when the third line was cleared, had stopped transmitting. Whether the silence was a deliberate decision to relocate before resuming, or the result of a command structure whose coherence had fractured under 94 minutes of simultaneous pressure, that is, reserve allocation and communications architecture, had not been able to respond to, the intelligence assessment at 6:26 a.m. could not determine. What was determinable was the operational significance. A Russian regiment whose command net had gone silent, while 3 of its defensive lines were held by Ukrainian forces 7.3 kilometers into its depth, could not coordinate a counterattack, could not direct its reserve, and could not provide the division above it the information it needed to assess the situation and respond. The reserve company that had been moving west since 6:16 a.m. arrived at the third line area at 6:41 a.m. The third line was held by Ukrainian forces. The reserve company's commanding officer had no communication from the regimental command, no communication from the second line's battalion command post, which had been destroyed in the fire's preparation at 4:15 a.m. He could see Ukrainian vehicles at the third line positions through his optics at 3.2 kilometers range. He transmitted 3 times on the regimental command net. No response. He transmitted once on the divisional command net, reported his position, and requested orders. The division acknowledged at 6:44 a.m. and directed him to hold pending situation assessment. The reserve company held. The division's assessment was going to take time. The third line stayed Ukrainian. The front had not collapsed in the sense of a rout. Russian forces in adjacent sectors were holding their positions. The divisional second echelon was intact. What had collapsed was the Russian regiment's command coherence. Command coherence is what allows the defending force to reconstitute, reallocate, and counterattack before the attacking force consolidates. The regiment whose command net had gone silent at 6:19 a.m. could do none of those things. The reserve company holding 3.2 kilometers from the third line on division orders, awaiting a situation assessment conducted without current information from the regiment, was a reserve not preventing the 46th from consolidating a 7.3-kilometer penetration while the clock ran. Don't miss the follow-up breakdown of the divisional response that developed over the Thursday afternoon and whether the regimental command reconstituted before the 46th consolidation was complete. Subscribe to my channel and hit that bell. 94 minutes is a number that captures the assault's duration. It does not capture the 11 days of preparation that made it possible. The submerged bridges rehearsed 4 times in the dark. The EW deception window calibrated to the 40-second Russian radar classification time. The air assault force landing pattern designed around 13 minutes of ground element closing time from the river. The HIMARS pre-targeting of the reserve company's route, built from 11 days of TB2 tracking. Every decision in the 94 minutes was the execution of something planned, rehearsed, or collected on in the 11 days before 4:11 a.m. The 94 minutes was the delivery. The 11 days was what was being delivered. NATO support had built the delivery system, the Leopards that crossed submerged bridges and engaged Kornet positions at 1,400 meters. The trophy APS that intercepted 3 of 4 missiles and survived the 4th on composite armor. The Bradleys that destroyed 3 BTR-82As in 4 minutes from 800 meters. The Excalibur round that killed the Ridge Kornet team 47 seconds after it wounded a gunner. The HIMARS that halted the reserve company and gave the exploitation force its arrival margin at the third line. The TB2 that tracked every Russian vehicle in the operational area from before launch to after the command net went silent. All of it was NATO capability employed by Ukrainian crews in a Ukrainian planned operation against a Russian regiment that had not found the answer to the combination. Was the front collapse, the regimental command net going silent at 6:19 a.m., primarily the result of the 94-minute operational speed that denied the command structure time to reconstitute, or the result of the specific decision sequence that destroyed the 2 battalion command posts in the fire's preparation, leaving the regiment operating at company commander level when the assault reached the second line? Type S if operational speed was the primary cause. Type C if the command post strikes in the fire's preparation were more decisive. Make your case below. The Dnieper's eastern bank at 6:41 a.m. on Thursday had 7.3 kilometers of Ukrainian-held ground that had been Russian-held ground at 4:11 a.m. The river that both sides had treated as a natural operational boundary. The barrier whose western bank was Ukrainian and whose eastern bank was Russian by the logic of preceding months of static contact, had the 46th Airmobile Brigade on it, consolidating, calling fires through the TB2 on the reserve company 3.2 kilometers east. The regimental command net was silent. The reserve was holding on orders. The third line had been cleared in 6 minutes. The 94 minutes had done what the 11 days of preparation had been designed to make possible. The front had collapsed in the way that really matters. Not with a route, but with a silence on a frequency that no one on the Russian side was answering. If this breakdown delivered the analysis you came here for, like the video, share it, and subscribe to my channel. Every minute of the 94, every decision, every capability, we build it all out completely. Which moment in Thursday's 94 minutes was most operationally decisive? The EW deception window that gave the helicopters an unchallenged crossing, the air assault infantry hitting the northern Kornet positions from the east while the ground assault came from the west, the HIMARS strike that halted the reserve company before it reached the third line, or the 6-minute third line clearance that produced the regimental command net silence? Drop your analysis below.